So once again, good morning everyone and welcome to this morning's PestFax webinar. My name is Cindy Webster and I am the PestFax newsletter editor and I will be hosting behind the scenes today. This webinar has been funded by the Department of Primary Industries and Regional Development as part of the IPM for Grains project that is mentioned on the screen. And Svetlana Micic, our deep herd entomologist, is presenting today's webinar. Svetlana is based at our Albany deep herd office. Before I hand over to Svetlana, I just thought I'd let everyone know that we are keeping our attendees muted today just to try and increase our sound quality, but we are keen for your questions. So please use either the Q&A tool or even the chat just to send your questions and comments through, and we'll try and answer them at the end of the webinar. And we'll be also recording this webinar and putting it on our Deep Herd YouTube channel and circulating the PowerPoint slides afterwards. So we'll be getting this information out to everyone afterwards. And I will now hand over to Svetlana.
Well, everybody, welcome. Well, what I'll be covering today is just a recap of what happened in 2020, what we need to probably have a look at in 2021, and covering the Russian wheat aphids, fall armyworm, and snails and slugs. But again, keep those questions coming in about anything else. And also just a recap on why we need to really look at what sprays we're applying, because we need to conserve the natural enemies we have in our landscape, because quite a few of our pests are resistant to insecticides. And the other thing I will just mention at the very end is about the resistance testing we'll be doing for red-legged earth mites again in 2021. Well, what did we find from 2020? Really, this is a year that, apart from COVID-19, which I have to admit, for those of us that work in agriculture, we really weren't affected as much as those people that work in retail. However, it was a tough start to the season. With that dry start meant that we did get quite a lot of reports of patchy germinating crops, and the fact that we did have a green bridge across a lot of the growing areas. We were monitoring the green bridge to see what was in it. We did find Diamondback Moth. The interesting thing about the Diamondback Moth that was in that green bridge is that it really didn't build up in number until spring. So we were expecting it with the dry start, the green bridge, that germinating crops would have more of an issue than what they did. We, as a consequence of that green bridge, I suspect also had more of an issue with native budworm. We had earlier flights of native budworm occurring into our broadacre growing regions, which did pose a risk to some of the crops, and some crops did have to be sprayed. One thing that we got a lot of reports about is that sprays that have been applied, especially in canola crops, pre-emergence but post-seeding, didn't control insect pests effectively. We still found that we were getting desiantha weevil damage occurring in canola. And a lot of the questions that were coming about was, is desiantha weevil showing resistance? And when we looked at it, we actually saw that it's actually got a cryptic habit. So it has a habit of being under stubble and under plant matter, which meant that it actually wasn't coming into contact with the sprays that were applied. Also, the other thing that we did have was any of the seed dressings that were applied to especially canola and cereal crops. What we found was that as the season progressed, we found high levels of aphid activity and mite activity on those particular crops. And what we think has happened is that we've had peak hatching occurring all from mid-May to about mid-June, which coincided with very small crops, and that meant we actually ended up getting a lot of crop damage. The other thing we did have is, again, sprays being applied and pests not being quite identified. So again, Bryobia mite does require different control measures to something like a red-legged earth mite. However, one thing that was brought up in 2020, which is a pest that hasn't really been on my radar since about, and before I even started in the 1990s, was we did have cockchafer damage occurring in localised areas, pretty much from and again, localised paddocks, so not entire port zones, but we had reports of cockchafers causing damage to crops in the Kwinana East, Kwinana West port zones, and the Esperance and Albany port zones. In the Albany and Esperance port zones, when we actually looked at the species, it was African black beetle, which is quite common. In the Kwinana West port zone, it was actually Heteronicus obesus, which is a native cockchafer, and it just happened to coincide that the crops were germinating and we had really large cockchafers present. Some of those crops did require reseeding, Sprays were not very effective because, as you all know, cockchafers feed on the roots of plants and they're actually present below ground. The interesting observations that were made with heteronyx is, in the past, we've said it can damage pretty much all crop types. What the farmers who had quite a lot of damage occurring in their crops actually noticed was in the pasture systems, they did have a preference for the barley. So the barley was consumed before anything else. And so that was actually quite an interesting finding. The other thing that we found was that there's actually species of cockchafers out there that we actually don't know what they are. This particular species we expect is a native. We are trying to rear it up to the adult stage, and it is, I think, 35 weeks and still going to try and rear it up to become an adult so we can get a definitive identification. So, take home message from that is, if you are finding cockchafers causing damage to cereals, please collect a sample. Let's see if we can get the larvae identified. We can definitely identify African black beetle and heteronyx from larvae. And if it's anything else, look, it might need that we might need to rear it out and just see what's happening. The other thing that we had happen in 2020 was we've had 2 new pests arrive into our landscape, Russian wheat aphid and fall armyworm, of which I'll talk a little bit more about later. One of the other things that we did do last year was we had a GRDC project where we looked at what we could actually see in chaff, because as you are all very aware, we are looking at retaining chaff on site simply because burning does have a detrimental impact at times. So there's a lot of farmers who are retaining chaff, whether it's in chaff dumps, chaff lines, or chaff tram lining. And we undertook a project to actually see whether that retention of chaff will lead to greater Slater or European earwig activity. So those are the pests that are closely related to chaff. One of the controls we've always said is if you burn your chaff, you will decrease the habitat that slaters and European earwigs have, and possibly even cause a decrease in their population. So we have had some farmers do that. Unfortunately, what this needs to be couched in terms of, you also need to be aware of what the soil type is and what the harborages is that these pests are in, because what we found was that when you remove all the chaff, if these pests are under rock piles or in cracking clay soils, they actually can survive the burn quite nicely. And then they concentrate on the germinating crop because there is no organic matter for them to feed on. So they then concentrate on feeding on germinating crops, especially canola. So that's something to bear in mind, that you can effectively control slaters if they're not in or under rock heaps or in cracks, because they do require moisture to survive summer, and they do require moisture to survive in our growing season. But when we actually looked at what was in the chaff, and this is just by visually looking at the chaff, you could see that if you're looking at the pests, Albany and Esperance port zones here on the left have the highest number of pests. And if you just look and you look at that and go, right, well, Geraldton, Kwinana East, Kwinana West port zone, bugger all problems, we don't need to worry about them. And if you looked at the natural enemies, you'd go, right, well, Albany and Esperance have lots. What we actually also did was we put pitfall traps in the ground. What we actually found is that when you do put pitfall traps in, you do capture quite a different species complex. And it just means that when you're out there in the paddocks and you are looking for what could possibly be doing the damage, it might be a good idea to pop a pitfall trap in, simply because at that time you may not be actually finding the culprit. And the interesting thing was in our pitfall trapping, we did find that there is a lot of weed seed ants in the Kwinana East port zone area. And it just shows that we do have those predators out there that are predating on the weed seeds and causing reduction, which I thought was quite a nice story. But what about 2021? Oh my goodness, we do have a green bridge across our landscape. We have been undertaking green bridge surveillance. To date, we found very low levels of activity of aphids and of Diamondback Moth. However, we are getting quite a few reports of native budworm being present across all port zones. And what you might not be aware of is we are also getting a lot of native caterpillars being found in and on weeds. So something like the tar vine caterpillar, which is found in the Geraldton port zone area predominantly, feeds only on tar vine. It is not a crop pest. The issue here, though, is that this particular caterpillar is feeding on the tar vine to the point that herbicides are not going to be effective. So that's something to bear in mind, that you may have other pests in the other caterpillars in the paddock that will be feeding on the weeds. And if they feed on that green plant material quite effectively, you may not be getting effective weed control. So that's just something to bear in mind. The other thing that you do all need to keep in mind is it's not things that fly in that can do the most damage. It's those resident pests, the pests that are present in your paddocks year in, year out. In 2020, we had those germinating canola have a delayed start, red-legged earth mites causing damage, and a lot of people got caught out because they hadn't expected to have such a mass hatching of red-legged earth mites. So if you had red-legged earth mites last year in your cereals, bear in mind that if you are going to be planting a canola crop, you could possibly have an issue this year as well. We are also getting some reports of locusts and grasshoppers across the landscape. We had reports from all port zones last year of some being the Australian plague locust, but we do have a number of grasshopper and locust species in our landscape. But we had reports of quite a few across all port zones present in paddocks, not causing any issues at harvest, but people just reporting them because they were concerned. If right now you are seeing any locusts or grasshoppers, bear in mind that they can be a risk to germinating crops. We have already had reports of crop damage, mainly from the Albany port zone in localised areas in pastures due to what appears to be wingless grasshoppers, but that identification is still to come through. So if you are seeing anything jumping around, it might be a good idea to put in control measures before the crop comes out of the ground, because it's much easier to control grasshoppers and locusts when they're at the nymphal stage before they start flying around. One thing that we are expecting that will be present throughout our broadacre growing areas is the Russian weed aphid. This particular aphid species was first found in Esperance last year. It came into Australia in about 2016. It was found in South Australia, and it's taken about 4 years, and we finally got it in Esperance. This particular pest is manageable. It has a preference for barley. There is a threshold calculator available from GRDC. We expect that it will be present in our broadacre growing areas and it will persist year in, year out. It has a really wide grass host range, so it will be able to survive a hot, dry summer. We expect that it will only be an issue in broadacre growing areas and won't be a problem outside of that. I do need you to be able to identify this aphid, and the reason that we'd like you to be able to identify it is, unlike our other aphid species, the Russian weed aphid does inject a toxin into the plant, which can cause the plant to become stunted, and that's what actually causes the yield loss. So it's not their feeding damage that causes yield loss in the crop, it is the toxin that's actually in their saliva. The Russian weed aphid has lovely black eyes, light green body, and no funculi. So these are the exhaust pipes at the back end. So you can't actually see them. The Russian weed aphid can be identified from a photo. So use a hand lens on your mobile phone and we can identify it. It differs from the other cereal aphid we get in our landscape, which is the oat aphid. The oat aphid does have rusty red patches at the bottom end, and the sifunculi are quite prominent. The other thing the Russian weed aphid does have is a double quarter. So it's got this double tail. This is actually quite difficult to see, but you will always see the black eyes, light green body, and you can even see here that the antennae has a slight black patch at the end, but it is a very easily identifiable aphid. And the reason we would like you to be aware of it is because it has caused up to 30% yield loss in South Australia. It's been a rare occurrence. The plants were stunted, and you can see this purpling on the leaf, and that's one of the causes of the damage. And in this particular property did have quite high numbers of Russian weed aphid, because you can see just at the underside of the leaf just how many aphids there actually are. You don't need many aphids to cause the chlorotic markings. So that's this striping on the cereal leaf. So you can see longitudinal striping of basically pink, white, dark green, light green lines. In this particular plant, you can see here there's only 2 little aphids. That's all we found, but the chlorotic markings were quite prominent. It causes white grain heads in the barley, and that's really what causes the yield loss. And stunted plants can also just not yield very well. The other thing that they will do is they do cause furling of the flag leaf. We will be undertaking research this year to see what it's doing in the landscape in Esperance, how widespread it is, and where it actually is. So please keep us in mind. If you are out and about and you see some plants that don't look quite right, please take a photo of the plant. Please look for the aphid and let us know if you find it. Last year, it was only found in 24 sites around Esperance. We have looked at the Green Bridge there, that's in Esperance at the moment, to see if we could find any Russian weed aphid. It's a little bit like looking for a needle in a haystack, because the Russian weed aphid does prefer barley grass, and we're only just now getting barley grass at germination. So we'll be increasing our surveillance as the season progresses, concentrating on barley grass to see if we can find where the Russian weed aphid is in our landscape. What we are expecting to come this year is fall armyworm. Now, fall armyworm is like our other armyworm species in that it congregates together and it can cause widespread damage. The difference between fall armyworm and our native armyworm is that the fall armyworm has a very wide host range. We expect that it will be a pest of every crop that we grow in our broadacre growing region. So this is a particularly one of concern. We also expect it will be an issue in our horticultural growing areas south of Perth. The fall armyworm is a tropical pest, so we expect that it is not going to persist in the broadacre growing areas. It's going to be like native budworm, flying in and flying out as the season progresses. There has been trapping programs to determine where it has spread since it was first found in Kununurra in 2020. So those red dots are the trapping program in the horticultural growing areas, and where it's red, fall armyworm was found. Where it's white, no fall armyworm was found. We extended the trapping program to the broadacre growing areas. But I will just point out here that fall armyworm, unlike native budworm, has nice white wings. Budworm has black patches. Very unlikely that you're going to find the adults in a crop, but our trapping program relies on pheromone traps, and we are trapping adults to see what's in our landscape. So last year, this map on the right-hand side shows you where our trapping program was, and no fall armyworm were found. We expect that this year we're going to see a lot more red in our broadacre growing areas. Now, I do need you to be able to identify fall armyworm. It can be confused with some of our species of caterpillar in our landscape. I will say right now, if you see anything that's unusual, please collect a sample. We do need a sample of fall armyworm to do a definitive identification, But fall armyworm can be identified by the 3 white stripes on its collar, which is what all armyworm have. They also has this upside down Y on its head. On the back end, it's got these 4 dots which form a square, and in the middle of the body, it has dots that form a trapezoidal shape. Its frass is quite brownish in colour. It doesn't, like a normal armyworm in cereals, has hay bale type frass, nice little square greenish bales. This one doesn't. It is actually brown frass. It is controllable by sprays, but we do have some resistance alleles that have been detected. There are permits for fall armyworm in our grain crops, which can be found on the APVMA website. They're also on the DPIRD websites. We expect that as the season progresses, we will see it coming in, and well, it's going to be an interesting one when it gets here. One thing that we have been getting asked, or I've been getting asked quite a bit, is when to bait for snails. We are having snail problems from Geraldton, Kwinana West, Albany and Esperance port zones now. Again, in the Geraldton port zone, it is limited to that Dongara area, but every year we are getting asked more questions. Please bait evenly. So the more even the bait spread is, the more likely it is that snails and slugs will encounter the baits. You need to bait before egg laying occurs and when these pests are actively moving. When do they move? Slugs will move as soon as it's dark and it's been moist and there's been rain. Snails, and we have looked at footage, like hours of footage, and basically what we've looked at is the temperature. So you can see from this graph, we've got temperature down one side, we've got relative humidity down the other, and then we've scored movement up and down. And pretty much the take-home message is that slugs are night active, and they're only active during the autumn-winter period. Snails, on the other hand, if humidity is above 85% on the ground, they're moving. But this is where everyone goes, but when are they laying eggs? Because we want to kill them before they lay eggs. With slugs, we found that the albumin gland, which is the gland that needs to be formed for the pest to lay eggs, we found that as soon as you find a slug in the landscape, its gland is fully developed and it's already ready to start laying eggs if it's a large size. So looking at something about 1 centimetre or more in size. For snails, take-home message there is, over all the years that we've run this program and looked at the size of the albumin gland, pretty much from mid-March to mid-April is when the gland starts to develop, and you really need to have baited by now to get numbers right down. The problem that we've got right now, and this is an issue for slugs as well, is that any green in the paddock will detract from the baits. So slugs and snails, if they encounter green, will feed on the green plant material before they feed on a bait. So if you haven't got a brown bridge in the paddock, so the green bridge hasn't been browned out, it's highly probable baiting is not going to be as effective. I have undertaken a few dissections this year, and albumin glands in the South Stirlings are definitely developed. So I expect that that's the case in other parts, that we do have snails that have probably already started to lay eggs. One thing that has been trialled, and everyone has really would like to do a spray or to do anything like that, we found that sprays are not effective against either of these pests, against slugs or snails. We've also found that the controls that you use for round snails, such as rolling or speed tillering or cabling, have not been effective. Stirling Stocosts have just finished a trial and found that cabling, speed tillering, and stubble crunching have not decreased pointed snail numbers enough. For those of you that have burnt, bear in mind that burning doesn't necessarily control slugs such as the black keel. They can be present underground, and even tillage may not control these particular pests, so just bear that in mind. For anyone who hasn't been able to bait snails right now, you may need to look at cleaning snails from the grain, and it's a really good idea to plan for that early because cleaning snails is a difficult thing to do. I just wanted to highlight why we want you to really consider using insecticides that are more pest specific, simply because we do have green peach aphid, which are tolerant to many insecticides. We do have other insecticide groups coming out for green peach aphid control. If it's not out this season, it'll definitely be out next season, and we'll put it out through PestFax about what's available. The one thing is that those natural predators will feed on Russian wheat aphid as well as green peach aphid. So if they're present in the landscape, they won't necessarily control an exploding aphid population. They will control aphids that are developing new colonies. And fall armyworm, we expect that the natural predators we have in the landscape will also feed on fall armyworm. Again, if the population's out of control, they're not going to control an exploding population, but they can keep low populations in check. So just consider some of those insecticides that you're applying throughout the season. The other reason to consider insecticides that you're applying throughout the season is that every time you apply an insecticide, you're getting non-target pests being affected. So we do have red-legged earth mites, which are now resistant to OPs, and this is not just omethylate, but it is chlorpyrifos and other insecticides, as well as synthetic pyrethroids. We are doing resistance testing, so please, if you do see higher than expected levels of red-legged earth mites, even if they're not causing crop damage, it's better to get tested and have an idea of if resistance is a factor so that you can plan for next year. Because ultimately, once they start causing crop damage, it's very difficult to control red-legged earth mites that have dual resistance. If you see anything unusual in the landscape, please report it using PestFax Reporter. We really do rely on you. And if you need or would like to send any samples in, please contact Cindy or myself, and we can arrange samples to get identified. So please do contact us. And now we've got the question and answers. So hopefully we've got some there, Cindy.
Yes, we do, Svet. Thank you very much. So we have got 2 questions at the moment. I'll start with the first one that came in earlier on at the presentation when you're talking about what you're currently hearing about in the landscape. So we will ask, are aphids and Diamondback moth in all port zones as well, or in a specific area? This was when you're discussing what you had been hearing at the moment.
In all port zones, but low levels. So this is just one where the Diamondback monitoring project, all the traps have just been put out. So we've got traps that have gone from Geraldton all the way to Esperance across all port zones. And the Green Bridge has been assessed to see what we can see, and low levels have been found. So as the season progresses, we will be giving more updates about what the traps are finding. Now, the traps are a pheromone trap, so it's only attracting the adults. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's caterpillars in the adjacent crop, because that's what we found last year. Even though we were catching adults, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have a massive issue with the caterpillars, but it is something just to keep monitoring.
Thank you, Svet. Our second question is in regards to your snail section. Is that same snail regime applicable to vineyards where the concern is September, October and early crop development as the vines are finishing the season now? I think this is in regards when you're talking about managing the snails.
Now, in vineyards, this is the interesting thing. Unlike our broadacre growing areas, some have an issue with round snails, some have an issue with small pointed snails, and quite a majority have an issue with the garden snail. The garden snail is a little bit of a different critter. So there is a project with Richard Fennessy right now, which is looking at best practice management for the garden snail. And the garden snail we know lays its eggs from autumn, but it undergoes a period where it just doesn't really like the cold weather, so it stops moving, unlike the small pointed and the round snails, which keep moving all year round. So not all year round, all winter round. So look, for the garden snail, we do recommend controlling early and trying to stop them before they do lay eggs, but we know that they've got 2 times of egg lay, so it's early and late in the season. So keep in touch with Richard Fennessy's group as to the best practice controls.
Okay, thank you, Svetlana. And last question, because we've just reached 8:30. Is there any variety of barley that Russian wheat aphid prefer or like more?
No, we don't have any cereals in Australia at the moment that have any tolerance to Russian wheat aphid. There wasn't a particular barley variety that Russian wheat aphid preferred, and I should have actually mentioned that best practice control measures for Russian wheat aphid is to put a insecticidal seed dressing in on the seed, which most of our barley in the southern areas does have. And while I'm on what I've forgotten to mention, I will actually mention for slaters and European earwigs, Transcend is now registered for use in crop. This is a bait that has fipronil and metaldehyde as its active ingredient, so it can be now applied for the control of slaters and earwigs.
Thank you very much, Svetlana, for answering those questions and for doing that presentation overall. As we've said on the screen, we will be putting this webinar recording on the DPER YouTube channel, and I will circulate the PowerPoint slides to all registered attendees and we'll put them on our website for people to view. And so I'd like to say thank you very much for everyone who joined us today, and we'll say goodbye for now, but feel free to follow us up with any questions, any identification queries or reports. We would love to hear from you. So we'll say goodbye for now, but hopefully we will hear from you all in the future, and have a great rest of your day. Okay, goodbye everyone.
Thank you.